This videotape is edited from an advanced training in Boulder, Colorado, May 1988. Many of the participants had also attended 2 advanced trainings with Richard 6 and 9 months earlier. The first day of the training, Richard teaches and installs the major elements of a positive learning strategy in preparation for the next 3 days. The rest of the training is devoted to how people build and maintain generalizations using time and metaprogram distinctions. Since this training is a carefully sequenced one, you will gain most by viewing the tapes in order.
I wanted to go back to some of the thing about timelines. Now, for our purposes here, with what we're attempting to do, timelines have an interesting effect, because part of what we're trying to structure in the 4 days here is to begin to make sense out of how you know what to do. Now, part of the thing about knowing what to do is being in the right state to do it in, which is what we were dealing with yesterday. That, for me, NLP is not just a methodology, it's also an attitude. And see, for example, one of the major parts that, some of you may not have changed in your belief system, which you might get around to, is that you really have to have the belief that you can do, that anything is something that can be done. Because you see, if there is anything that you can't do, you don't have to worry about it, because you just won't be able to do it. So if you have the attitude that you're going to be able to do anything, it's only a question of when. See, failure itself is defined by time limits. And one of the things that will count, especially if you see private clients, that one of the things that you will hear from them is that when you begin to hear the word try in sentences, it usually will be justifying having the limitations that they do. They'll say things like, well, I quit smoking, and then 3 weeks later I started again. Now, they usually use that as a description that the process that they used didn't work, rather than it occurring to them that they didn't continue to use it. Which is, it's one of those things that happens, is that the procedures themselves, if they produce the effect, then if the client has, inside of the meta program, a passive experience. For example, just the other day I was seeing a client, and the client literally said to me, that it had to do with something, I think, about alcoholism. And they wanted to be able to have a couple drinks and stop, and they had a big road sign that we installed in their mind that went, "Stop drinking." Nice big sign. Of course, we didn't make it green, we made that one red. And what happened was he told me, he said, the sign, he said, well, if it was there, would pop in big and bright right at the right moment. And then after 3 weeks, it didn't work. And I asked him, I said, well, did it just stop working all at once? Or did it gradually, stop working? And he said, well, it kind of did it gradually. I said, well, what happened? Did it work sometimes and not others? Or did the sign fade or what? And he said, yeah. He said, the sign began to fade. Now, when somebody uses, and this is what I want you to start doing, is tuning your ears up to really hear meta-model distinctions rather than challenge them. You see, the reason it was structured in the meta-model that we taught people to challenge these things was to teach them to hear them, not to teach them to verbalize constantly like little robots. What we wanted to do was to attune people's hearing. By having them challenged, we thought if we had them actively participate in the process, that by doing something we would know whether or not they noticed it. But it didn't mean that we wanted people to constantly question people. What we wanted was them to hear the actual distinction itself. Because when somebody says, the sign began to fade, well, one of the things you know is that they are not driving their own bus. That, it's like the sign has a life of its own. It's, when people describe to you that they have voices, and for example, have you done belief changes with people, and when you tell them to move a picture, they tell you they can't? Right? They go to move it and they go, it won't move. That's different than the person who says, I am unable to move it. Those are 2 totally different utterances, and it tells you something about what it is that you have to accomplish. Because when people are passive in relationship to their own mind, then the first thing you have to do is you have to begin to get them to be active. Now, for those of you who, for example, saw the tape of me working with Andy, the little paranoid schizophrenic, one of the things about Andy is that these figures in his mind that were torturing him, the little figures that came off the TV set and ragged on him and nagged him and stuff, was that when he described them, they weren't his. He didn't have ownership. And when people describe their mental process in a disassociated form, which, by the way, is one of the dangers of doing the kind of reframing, six-step reframing, is that when you give parts too much a life of their own, it can work either way. They can work like a good post-hypnotic suggestion, but it also, if it becomes too much of an entity, for example, I found people who started naming internal parts. And, this is just a precursor to creating a multiple personality, especially when you give them different names. I was down in Phoenix, and went in somebody else's seminar, and was watching somebody, and they were doing a little reframing piece, and they had them give each of the internal parts a different name, either female or male. So there was Alice and Frank and George, right? Just as a way of remembering, of course, which is what the person, when I slammed them against the wall to find out why they were teaching people to do this, as I put a certain amount of pressure on their ear, they began to explain to me, it's only a way for people to keep track of it. But however, when you are carrying on separate conversations with internal parts that have their own name and their own personality, this doesn't strike me as a real good therapeutic move. Because what you're doing is you're making people more disassociated than they already are, and also more passive in relationship to controlling their own mind. Now, there's always going to be an interplay because there's things that you want to be automated. In the man's case, you want the sign to come up automatically so he doesn't have to stop and do it, because after a couple of drinks, it's going to go, it's too much trouble to make a sign now. Let's have a drink and think about it. Now, what we want is the sign to pop in. But if he notices the sign is beginning to fade, then what we need to do is either make him extra ones or begin to make sure that he knows that when it's there at all, he's got to make it brighter. Because part of the process of being able to forget to do things that you want to do is to get them out of your mind. It's the structure of procrastination itself, is that in order to procrastinate, if you're motivated to do something, see, for example, if you stop and think about it, there's two very strong classes in the motivation that we talked about. Both were things that you wanted to do. One was easy and one was difficult. Now, the thing is that stalling actually requires extra energy. It really does. People who procrastinate are not lazy. They're busier than other people and have a lot less free time because they have all that mental stuff going on. Andy said to me in this session, he actually mentioned to me, he said that he thought, because when he goes to the bank, he said that he thought it was more work for him to walk from his house to the bank with all the stuff he had to deal with internally than most people had to do when they went out and worked at a job. And I was forced to agree with him. Because I said, well, how many episodes do you have to have between your house and the bank? And he said, 10, 12. And then you had to stop and get the voices down and the pictures and all this stuff out of the way. It's a lot of work, It's a lot of work to run your own brain. It's a lot easier if it would just do it itself. Now, when people begin to describe, whether it's in business consulting or whatever, that they don't have the ability to control some part of themselves, you can hear the difference in them when they begin to describe, because they always claim it's their problem. They'll come in and they'll go, well, I have this terrible problem. And you go, what is it? And they'll say, well, I start drinking and they'll say, and I can't stop myself. Immediately you begin to hear the disassociation at that point, as soon as they can't stop themselves. But then when you start to question them and ask what happens internally, they say, well, I tell myself I should, but I don't. Now, when people say things, and you'll hear it in phrases like when people say to you, I can't, all of the things which are limits, I can't, I know I should, but it's just that, this voice keeps nagging me. For example, this guy I worked with just recently in Tucson, he was a compulsive, and he had to compulsively, did little rituals in his religion. And if he wasn't sincere enough, he had to do them over again. So that things that were supposed to take 3 minutes, he was spending 3 hours. And he had this voice that was screaming at him, when he was doing it, that he wasn't sincere enough and to do it over. And I, of course, asked him the question, which I typically do initially. I said, has it occurred to you to just not do that? And he said to me, I can. And I said, well, try it. What's one of the things that would make you have to do one of these rituals? And one of them has to do with, since he was a compulsive, if you touched his hands, he had to wash his hands, and then he had to say a certain thing after he washed his hands. So I immediately, of course, I went, there, now we have something to work with. So he washed his hands, and he came in, and he sat down, did his little thing. And what happened was I said, do you have to do it over again? He said, yeah. He said, the first 2 lines I was sincere, but then I wasn't sincere. You know. When I sit and listen to people say this shit, you know, sometimes I look at them and I go, are you serious, man? Give me a fucking break. You know. You have to be wealthy to have problems like that. You know, they have to pay you to have problems like that. You know, you just can't function in the world like that. This guy has so much trouble, by the way. He has a tendency to get to work like about 7 or 8 o'clock at night instead of 8 in the morning. You can understand why. Fortunately, he does legal research so that you can get away with that. But, you know, one time he came in just at the same time his boss did. His boss said, finally on time for work. And no, he had actually been there all night and had just gone off for coffee. But, so when this guy comes back and he goes to the ritual, I said, why don't you just not make the voice? Because the voice also was right in front of his face like that, screaming out. And he said, he said, I can't stop it. Now, this is the point where your ear has to tune in to find out what's in control and what's out of control. Because there's a real difference to the degree that you're going to work with something and about how much it's generalized. You see, this little thing that I wrote up here is a thing from a field called decision theory. And decision theory is actually, there are people who make a living, they're called decision theorists. And they actually have these little color code wheels and stuff, and they go in and work with business people who are making decisions, because a lot of people who get in good decision-making positions don't have good decision-making strategies. They're called entrepreneurs. Well, they do real good to a certain point, and then when they hit a certain financial plateau, they don't have the ability to make the decisions. So they hire these college professors called decision theorists who've never made a dime in their life. And they bring these people in, and these people take them through a process. Now, the people who actually created the field of decision theory just actually broke it down into simple things. The thing is that in the environment there are certain fixed variables, like there are a certain number of hours in the day. Now, there are also a certain set of variables which are social variables. For example, most of us in here, not all of us, but most of us in here are native speakers of English. If not, we're a native speaker of some language. But being a native speaker of English, it puts a certain grid over your thinking process. If you're a native speaker of German, for example, there aren't modal operators of possibility in German. They simply, you can't say, you know, hey, what would you like to do today? You know, it's what must you do today? So they just don't have them in the language. They actually sent somebody from Germany to ask advice about how to translate one of my books, because the thing about modal operators of possibility drove them nuts. You know, they actually had to, in order, because I told them they had to do it that way. Of course, they could understand that. That's called pacing these constraints. So they had to make it a sense of the language which was not well formed. It was more like colorless green ideas, but it didn't make sense. You know, it was semantically ill-formed, but they could go ahead and do it anyway because I told them they had to, or it would be wrong. And worse than that, I told them it would be sloppy. Now, there's also a set of personal variables. Personal variables are the things that you learn as an individual, given that you're a native speaker of English. Some people grew up in the streets of New Jersey, and some people, grew up in Upper Long Island, and some people in the Deep South. And above and beyond that, even given the family that you grew up, you learn different things like values and beliefs and just straight ahead skills. Now, if you take all of these things, it's the job of a decision theorist to take an individual. Because when you take individuals and you have them make a list, or if you just listen to them, things that are supposed to be over here somehow or other end up on this list of environmental constraints. For Andy, part of the environment was his internal dialogue and his internal images. They weren't a personal thing. as far as he was concerned and the way he was living his life, they were part of the environment. That the internal voices or the internal pictures, the flag that came up, even though it was something we installed, that we sat down and I taught the guy himself to install, wasn't something that was personally his. It was part of the environment. Now, very often people make their beliefs part of the environment. That's why people like, when I started doing belief change work with people, because people were always asking me about it, and I could tell them it's not that hard. So finally I put the thing in whichever book it's in, I forget, Using Your Brain for Change, or one of those books, in there, with just say, if you change beliefs, you just find out what they are, and find out what they're not, and you change them. And when I do it in seminars, people would say, you mean you could just change a belief just like that? Now, the fact that they were so amazed is because they had that as a part of the environment. They didn't think of it as a nominalization. See, because it's not that you have a belief, it's that you believe something, and it's an ongoing process that you have to continue to do. And since it doesn't feel like an active process, people go, well, it's not one. Because see, if you say to a client, if they go, well, I can't do this because I don't believe I can, and you go, well, make yourself believe that you can. They'll go like this. It's like, it's like, I know I can do that, but I'm not supposed to know that. And I mean, you get gestures like that. It's like they duck when you say that. They really do. You can watch them. You go, oh, you don't believe you can do that? Well, just make yourself believe it. They go, nope, we can't do that. Now, there's a sort of one of the things is you begin to get, if you ask people things like, what would happen if you could just change your beliefs? Well, they go, well, if you could just change your beliefs like that, then you wouldn't know what to believe. And you'd go completely nuts. Now, that's got to be one of the worst pieces of logic I have ever heard. But I mean, that is like about one of the worst justifications I've ever heard for not changing one belief. I mean, but it sounds meaningful enough that I know that therapists have probably bought it. It's like they go, yeah, you wouldn't know what to believe. You're right. Now, it actually falls out. If you study predicate calculus, which is the study of valid but untrue logic, it actually is a logical fallacy. It's an invalid and untrue argument. But if your intonation sounds good, you can slide that shit right through. That's what Robert calls sleight of mouth. Now, the thing is that if you really stop and think about it, if you can change your beliefs, then you're going to pick ones that are worth having and keep them, as opposed to let them randomly occur. Now, see, for example, a lot of people believe, for example, that if you take understanding strategies, say, which is one of the things we're going to do a little bit today. I know some of you have gone through and elicited the thing about understanding and not understanding, but that's different than the way we're going to do it here. We're going to go back and we're going to examine that in terms of it being sequential and simultaneous, because we're going to, of course, change it. Because a lot of times people think that what it means to understand is to have a clear, focused image. Now, it doesn't mean they can do anything. See, to me, for our purposes, part of being a good neurolinguistic programmer is it's not that you, when somebody talks, you go, oh, and then you kind of goes, and it's gone, because it's sort of like an old anchoring thing. I discovered years ago that, I could say something that was clear and everybody understood, and they go, yeah, and I go, and anchor it, and then I could say the most unintelligible gibberish. And if I periodically did that, people would go, people would walk out and they go, that's the clearest lecture you ever gave. And I go, what was it about? They go, well, I don't know exactly. Right. But you do understand. And they go, oh. And I go, do you? And they go, oh, yeah. It didn't make, I don't know what it was, but boy, was it clear, and I understood every word. Then you tell me what subject it was about. Well, I don't exactly know the subject, but each idea was perfect.
That's horrible.
Hey, it's a loving. It's like if you do workshops in hostile places, what you do in the beginning is you start everybody out by telling them to close their eyes and think of a time they were totally delighted, and then tell them to open their eyes. Say, now, let's go. We go, what do you think about the workshop? People go, well, I was real delighted with it. Don't know what he was talking about, but I was delighted. Now, what we're after in this workshop here is a little bit different. We're going to be interested in being able to first identify which things are in the fixed and environmental constraints that actually belong in one of these two things. Because that these things are things that you can change. And of course, there's all different kinds of things that fall in personal constraints. I mean, there are some generalizations that permeate, and they permeate your life in relationship to time. Now, one of the reasons I want to start this morning with timelines is I want you to do an exercise. And this one, if you think the one yesterday had vague instructions, the instructions to this are even vaguer. But you have to understand, when they tell me I can teach a workshop where you have to sink or swim, I take them seriously. Now, the thing is that what we're going to do with time is I want you to examine, because I want to give you a couple of examples. Okay, if you think about somebody who is a depressive, depressives, for the most part, are not depressed all the time like they claim, right? Because if you ask them, you go, have you ever had fun? They'll go, well, not really. Now, whenever you hear the modifier words like really, and just, any word that's a modifier, you know there's a trick there, right? There's a mental trick going on. Now, part of your job is to identify those and to figure out what they mean, because they will all, for the most part, relate to time. Now, what the depressive does when they really enjoy themselves is they have the ability to look back through time and take, no matter how much fun they were having, you can actually do things with them. Like I've had sessions where they sat there and roared with laughter for an hour. Just, cracked up, had a great time. And then next week, I say, well, do you have any fun this week? And they go, well, no. And I go, well, what about the last session? And they go, well, at the time I thought I was enjoying myself. and they're real honest. And they say, but when I look back now, I don't think I really was. Now, what they have is the ability to, quote unquote, color experience through time in reverse. Now, it doesn't have anything so much to do with the moment, but it makes it so that they feel like, when they look back and think, well, since I didn't really have anything that I enjoyed last week, then they project forward, well, I'm probably not going to enjoy anything next week, so why even try? Now, the thing is that we have to start identifying when people have problems. For example, a problem with procrastinating is going to absorb a larger chunk of time than if you have a phobia of elevators. See, phobias of elevators, one of the interesting things is that, who's ever beeping, stop it. I'll do the anchoring here, thank you. You have watches that make noises, make them so they don't make noises, or put them out of this room. It's an anchor for me to become extremely violent in my unconscious behavior.
Out of your control.
Yeah, it's out of my control. It's a part of the environment. My medulla oblongata makes me do it. It's that old reptilian brain. Shiny object, bite. That sort of thing. Now, what I want you to do is I want you, in this exercise, I want you to go on a fishing expedition. Now, the fishing expedition is to find examples of things that have different durations in time that constitute a difficulty and, on the flip side, because the same thing works true. There are people that recode all their history so that things were never really that bad. Horrible. I've met people where that had terrible shit happen to them constantly. One of them I know had the worst luck you could imagine, but they were one of the most cheerful people that I know. And they always go, well, it was tough when I was going through it, but, it wasn't really that bad. That's the opposite of a depressive. But still, to them, the difference is that they've taken the same kind of a procedure and they put it in their control. They don't do it consciously, but they have an automated program that works for them. Now, if you took a depressive and switched them over to that, what's going to happen is that you're going to have somebody who will suddenly appear very unrealistic to the rest of the world. Talk about a violation of family ecology. This will become because they'll be waiting for them to go back the other way. And since they're all expecting it, they're going to make it happen. Trust me, that's what families are for. As far as I can tell. Virginia taught me that. She said, if you can go and do the best work with an individual, but if it's too radical of a change, the family will make sure that they go back. If it's a long-term thing, if it's a thing that goes through time. Now, for the kind of distinctions that we want to make here about time is there's a difference between things that move through time, things that are in time, and things that are between time. Between time is where people do comparisons. I'm not as happy as I used to be. I don't enjoy it as much. Is it, it's the fact that you enjoy it should be enough. The fact that you enjoyed it more once shouldn't make a bit of difference. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, all it does is tell you that, that you can enjoy it more sometime in the future. But for some reason, people build a generalization that since they enjoyed it with greater frequency 2 weeks ago, and now they're enjoyed it with less now, that in the future it's going to be even less, which is horrible logic. But people have a generalization about that. What you need to be able to do is to be able to break the generalization so that people can go through the natural ebb and flow called life. If your life, because what these people are insisting is that everything becomes more intense day by day from the date of birth to the date of death. You'd be so wound up, man, by the time you were 90, you'd be, what a pain in the... You don't have to have every day be better than the one before it. Take a vacation. You get time off from work. I mean, sometimes it strikes me as that people don't realize part of what makes things so they become more intense is that you back off a little bit. If you were always in a state of ecstasy, you wouldn't even notice. You'd probably just croak of a heart attack anyway. If life was one big orgasm, it'd probably only be about 3 or 4 hours long, And it wouldn't give you anything to notice, because what people perceive sensory-wise is difference. Even your eyes, in order for you to see, your eyes jiggle. Because you don't see things standing still. Your eyes actually jiggle in order to be able to perceive the difference in the light. They actually, how scientists are. Guess what they did? They attached something to the eyeball so that it moved with the jiggling. It had a little picture of a scene on it. And after a few seconds, it just went away. People couldn't see it because it's the actual movement of the eyeball that creates difference that allows you to perceive. All that stuff, if you guys read Gregory Bateson? One of our gurus about, founding fathers. He's one of the forefathers, I guess, of NLP, predecessors or whatever you call them. Gregory's work about it's the difference that makes a difference. All of our senses are that way. And, it's one of the reasons that, that if there's too much consistency, then you fail to notice it. This is one of the reasons, like, for those of you who do any body work, one of the things that Moshe realized is that when somebody's body was damaged in any kind of way, and they moved away from the pain, they tightened up muscles and stuff to be able to cope with things like wearing a cast or something. After the cast was off, the person is still walking like this, right? And of course, they keep compensating as if the pain is still there. But after a while, because of the consistency of it, they fail to notice that they're out of alignment with gravity. Now, like most body practitioners, what they do is they try to force you back. This is what I love. We'll just realign you. So they lay you down at the table and go, straighten you out. But of course, your senses don't know that you've been straightened out. So you stand up and slowly you go back out the way you were. Moshe, on the other hand, made you a little worse. He made you just enough worse that your body could notice it and you would readjust yourself back. It's one of the reasons his results were so much more profound than other body workers. He had a real talent for doing it. He used to do a demonstration. How many of you worked with Moshe at all? Do you remember the demonstration where he would take somebody and he'd work on one leg and then he'd have them stand up and walk in a circle? Right? And they'd walk like this. Right? One leg was totally longer. And then they go, are you going to do this one? And he'd go, no. And they go, why not? And he'd go, because your other leg will do it for me. And he said, just keep walking around. And he said, and your body knows how to adjust. Because he'd put it far enough out that your body could feel the shearing force of gravity.
and it would adjust it out. If you did it just a little bit, then you get stuck. But by making it so exaggerated, because everybody's a little tilted that one leg is a little longer than the other, but by pushing it out instead of in, what would happen is very rapidly people adjust themselves back to gravity because they can feel they're walking like this, as opposed to, if they're just a little bit off and they've done it for years, they don't really notice, You see them all the time, especially if you go to airports. After I worked with Moshe for the first couple of months, I couldn't go in. I had to wear blinders in the airport. Every time I looked at people, it was like, ah! Everybody, and it was like that commercial, where the guy gets the V8 and he's tilted. That's what the airport looked like. Everybody was walking at angles like that in the airport. I was trying to adjust myself by standing sideways so I wouldn't notice, except half were going this way and half were going that way. So I had to go back and forth real quick. Now, the thing is for us, is that what I want you to do is to identify two things. One is something that the person does extremely well and something that causes them a difficulty for each of these things here. One is something that goes through time. Because what you're looking for now is structure. And the thing is that you can, it's pretty easy. You can ask them what gives you a problem. A lot. And then the thing is that you'll discover there are things that occur periodically. There are things that are almost an overall tone. And then there are things that have to do with real specific in-time events. And they will usually be connected with very specific anchors. They'll either be a person or, they may not necessarily be a phobia, but, it could be, anxiety about certain things. It can be like, when they're, some people, like if they're alone and, and they know they have to go and talk in front of a group the next day, they'll keep themselves up all night so that they're all fucked up when they go and do it. That's part of my trainer's training program. I teach people to do that now. We did that last year by announcing the day ahead of time that I was going to let everybody co-teach with me so that they got to lay in bed the night before and worry about it. Yeah, we also gave great worrying strategies too. That was my predecessor of the horror movie. So great, you turn out the lights, and what you do is you look up at the ceiling and you wait until you see little white dots. Right? And then you wait and you turn one of them red and you have it zoom into your face and become a big distorted face that changes. That works real good. But I wouldn't recommend you try it. Just as a way of waking you up, Now, the thing is as you go on the fishing expedition, now, what I want you to remember as you go on this fishing expedition is that the way to get the examples is to control your questions. Now, when you learned the meta model, part of learning the meta model was to learn to control the quality of information. Now, if you ask when questions, what kinds of things are you going to be fishing for? What?
Time.
Well, yeah, but which of the three, guys? You're not going to get an answer, I know that, but, this relates to the subject we're talking about. Well, okay, if you're asking when questions, which of these three are you going to get? Between times. If you say, when are you happy, they're going to give you examples of when they're happy. Now, unless you begin to get answers like most always. Now, so when you go directly for something, if people can't supply it, right? Now, that's different. Now, if you ask what questions, what's that going to be directed towards? If I say, what makes you happy? That's cause-effect now. In time. Yeah. Yeah, but for multiple choice, you guys aren't doing real good. Let's go back to the horror nightmare.
Give us one more chance.
Give you one more chance. All right, if you guys don't get this one, though, then we're going to go back and do decision strategies. Now, all right, well, let's do it this way. What kind of question would you ask to get things that are through time?
How do you know when you're being here?
Well, if you say, how do you know when? If you ask questions about consciousness, in other words, challenges for things like loss performative is a consciousness challenge. Okay, when you have, that's like, how do you know when to be depressed?
Or how do you know you're depressed? Now, the thing is that if you stop and think about the major brackets of the meta model, the three major things like semantic ill-formedness, mind reading, and that includes their own mind, by the way, because a lot of times people have that as an environmental part of the environment. Say, when somebody says, says, well, I know he hates me, that's real obvious mind reading. But if somebody, says, I'm depressed, well, they're making claims about their own consciousness. Now, if they can't change it, then being depressed is not part of them. It's not something that they have any control over. It's just that I'm depressed. And I mean, I've had some depressants. I've had one lady that, of course, she worked at Stanford, so that makes sense. But she was depressed, and she was a depressive for 16 years. And I mean, she went through vitamin treatment and psychoanalysis, and psychotherapy, and just everything you could imagine. It was like a job, as far as I could tell. A very expensive job, as a matter of fact. And the thing is that as I began, when she came in, the first thing I said is I said, how do you know you're depressed? And she said, well, I'm pretty sure I'm depressed. And I said, well, maybe you're not. Now, this is where you begin to go for universal quantifier, because, if I go, maybe you're not, I said, maybe this is happiness. Now, when you go for universal quantifier, you're going to be asking questions about through time, because universal quantifiers are going to be going, are there exceptions? Because if I say, well, maybe this is happiness, and she goes, nah, I don't think so. And I said, well, is it always like this? She said, yeah. Now, I knew she was lying. But rather than go, always, never, just listen, pay attention to it, because it's going to begin to tell you where you have to work with the person. Because you see, if you make a specific event change when you're dealing with something that goes through time, next week it isn't going to count. So you'll be wasting your time. Now, if you're doing I'll tell you the between time ones are interesting, because when you're dealing with one that's between times, that's the one where you have to usually see the client more often, because it's not enough to just do one. Sometimes they need 2, 3, and sometimes 4 or 5 examples before it'll literally go in and build the generalization you want. And it's not that you really need to do it. Sometimes I try just having them play the tape of their therapy session, every 3 weeks, just to get out of having to see them again, because I know it's going to be the same session in essence, but all I'm trying to do is to get it to generalize. But since I'm dealing with an issue that has to do with sorting between times, that it just takes more sessions numerically. Whereas if you're dealing with something that's in time, this is the quick fix stuff. When you're dealing with in time stuff, this is the stuff you can do in one session. And this is what things like phobias are about. Phobias are something where no matter what the person is like, their timeline shifts like this, right? And so that if they even stop and think about, because the nice thing about phobics is you don't even have to really put them in the environment. Because most of them, I had one guy that had a phobia of elevators, and I asked him, I said, when was the last time you were on an elevator? And he said, 22 years ago. And I said, well, how do you know you're still afraid of them? I said, maybe you're not. I said, maybe it disappeared, It's just like you lost your taste for certain vegetables, or, certain candies when you were a kid. I said, maybe it just dropped off. I said, did you ever feel like you should just go test it? And he said, no. I said, I know it's there. He said, all I have to do is think about it. Yeah. Because every once in a while in his mind, he'd just think about being on an elevator and it'd scare him. That's his way of just, reinforcing those generalizations. Mental process, that people do and it is part of the way that we keep learnings alive. Now, this is how we keep believing things too. It's not a negative process. It's not something that's wrong. It's the way we keep the good stuff, but it's also the same mechanism we use to keep the stuff we don't want. Because things that are in time, otherwise you'd forget about them. You'd have amnesia. That's why, by the way, amnesia works good for in-time problems, where people, it's where they don't see it coming. It's that kind of thing where, like the guy that, drinks 2 drinks and he's going to stop and, he drinks 2 and then suddenly he has 40, and wakes up, in some other city, with a stranger in the bed, and it's a farm animal. Yeah. And then he goes out, 2 days later, he swears, then he goes to the health club and sweats it out, this is usually what they do. Swears he's never going to drink again as long as he lives, and then says, well, maybe I'll have just 2, right? But after 2, no more. and goes through the same process because that person is in time. They don't have their history out in front of them. They can't see it coming. Now, you'll discover that the timelines, that people have a timeline, but that it shifts from one state of consciousness to another. When people are operating between times, their timeline will typically be out in front of them in some fashion that goes from one side to the other. When people, and there are variations on this. Some people's goes up and down and some out at an angle. But basically what it means is that they can see that they've made the same mistake over and over again. It's the person who goes, oh man, I'm not going to get hooked again. If they can see that they got hooked 40 times in a row and it's right there in front of their face, they're going to go, I'm not going to do that. And this is what happens, for example, with junkies that finally get around to quitting and why they become so avid that everybody else quit. Non-smokers, the ones that become religious about it, the ones where you light a cigarette across the room and they start hacking and coughing and shit, the ones that you really want to hurt, the ones that made me take up smoking. Cigars. So I'd just like to have a factory I could carry around in my briefcase and take it out and spew it on them to get them to shut up. It's a thing where they become so much the other way, that they become evangelists. They feel compelled. But the thing is what they've done is shift it out so that they could see. That's why the whole thing about, I'm so-and-so and I'm an alcoholic, is that they have to get it out in front. Now, the technique doesn't tell you to just do that, because that technology, has only existed for 10 years now. And this word just hasn't gotten around. It's like I'm still amazed that that people still use the phobia cure. I mean, that has been around for so long. And when you ask people who are clinicians, I mean, here I am. I just moved to a new city in California, and I was sitting in a cocktail lounge, and I was talking to some guy at the bar, and he told me he was a psychotherapist. So I said, "Well, I have a friend who has a phobia. You cure phobias?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "How long does it take?" He said, "About 3 years." I said, "That seems like an awful long time. He's only had the phobia for 2. Ever the sadistic. Swill say on my tombstone, Richard never missed a cheap shot. Now, the thing is that I want you to use the meta model distinctions to ask questions. You don't need to go into great detail, because what we're here is I just want you to find out the different kinds of things that people have that run in these 3 different ways. This is only designed to familiarize you. I want you to get 2 examples of each and have one that they want and one that they don't want. I love that sound. Squeaking chalk. That's an in-time thing. Whenever it happens, it makes me happy. Okay, now, as soon as you've identified the examples, right, then I want you to figure out, I just want you to stop, but I don't want you to do anything about this. This is not, we're not doing therapy here. What we're doing is we're building theoretical knowledge about how to adjust our behavior so that when we go to make changes, we know where to start and what to do. This is just about familiarizing yourself with terrain. It's what the meta model exercises were supposed to be doing whenever you learn them. They're supposed to be familiarizing you with patterns about how people distort and delete information in the world. See, the process of nominalization, where people take processes and turn them into events, is a particular way in which people distort the world. When people say to you, my beliefs won't let me do this, right? They're not telling you that they're believing in something is simply incompatible with doing it. But they're not saying I'm not going to do it. They're saying my beliefs won't let me do it. So they're taking the beliefs and literally making them a fixed part of the environment. When they're not, they're things that can be changed. Now what I want you to do is see, because we have here 2 major categories. Something that you want and you have. And then there's something you don't want and you have it anyway. Now, there are probably things that they don't want and they don't have.
which would be worthwhile. Now, that only, of course, leaves one category. What I want you to do is to identify possible advantageous cases. In other words, when you're thinking of these things, I want you to think them in terms of not doing anything, but in terms of making decisions about building generalizations that are either, I want you to come up with, first finding two that are through time, two that are in time, and two that are between time. One they want and one they don't want. Okay? Then I want you to consider what would be possible to build that would be useful. For example, consider if your motivation strategy doesn't go through time. And then there are some motivation strategies that you want for particular kinds of things you want to be in time, so they're contextualized. Because where you contextualize things, of course, is in time. These are the ones that are context-oriented. And of course, between times is also going to be something that's very context-oriented. These will be relational things. And there are things where comparisons are useful between times, and there are things where it isn't. For example, if you take a decision strategy, and you're making decisions about what you want, if you make the decision between an ideal, in other words, like if you walk out and you see somebody, a married couple, right? And they look happy and delighted, so you decide you want to get married to be happy, right? And you go out and try to find a woman that looks exactly like the one that was in the couple. You're in deep, because even if you find one, it ain't going to work, right? But if you find one and they don't act quite right and you try to get them to change their behavior, it's going to work even worse. Now, and there are people that actually do this because they're operating with a between-time strategy for something that just doesn't work that way. It is inappropriate. Now, as you go on the fishing expedition, I don't want you to go out of your mind, but I want you to stop, consider, okay, inside the major distinctions in the meta model, there's cause-effect, limits, universal quantifiers, mind reading, loss performative, anything else?
Mobile operators.
Mobile operators of necessity and possibility. Use those things as ways of goading information. Now, I want to impress upon you that when you do elicitation, that all of the skills that you have learned everywhere count, right? I'm not real big on pacing a lot, because I usually figure, if the client's not willing to do it, they'll learn eventually. Well, it is, Hold your behavior constant and vary the world. Works. Now, the thing is but the stuff, all the kinds of pacing that count are the kind of pacings that you do, like things like voice tempo, voice tone, congruency. Remember, you're eliciting responses. I walked around yesterday, and some of you were more concerned with your notebook than there was the fact there was a person across from you. Remember, you're supposed to squeeze these things out. And remember, there's two ways that you can get information. One is you increase the range of your senses, right? This is where you ask questions and you squint and stare real close. Right? The old change of pasta technique. You guys remember that one. So you ask them about the last time they ate spaghetti, and if you look really close, you can see a noodle out of the corner of their mouth. It's the old calibration exercise. The alternative to that is to not waste your senses in quite that way, because it's important to get your senses to be better by doing those exercises, so that when you really elicit responses, it's like a big electric light. Because once you've tuned your senses up, then rather than leaving subtle responses, go for the gusto. The stuff you should be squeezing out should be dramatic. You want full tilt dramatic examples of things. You don't want something that's kind of successful in this case. When you ask for something that you ask them for something that they always do well. What's the attitude that you have that maintains itself always and you're most proud of? Remember, you can use modifiers back on the client too. What's the thing you're just the most proud of? Remember, if they can do this shit to you, you can do it back to them. That's the rules. If it works on you, it'll work on them. It's part of how language works. Language is the most indefensible of all systems because it happens unconsciously. People don't have any idea how they understand language. It's because they learned it when they were children. And They learn to process it by the phrase, and people always try to understand it by the word, and they don't stand a chance. Now, as you ask these questions, I want you to make sure that you understand that it's almost like doing a deep trance induction. Because what you're trying to do is to induce the state. You don't want to know about it, you want them in it. So in essence, it's trance induction to put them in the state. When you're eliciting a motivation strategy, you should be putting them in the trance called motivation, that altered state. And this requires congruency out of you, or maybe even incongruency. But the one thing it requires, first, foremost, and always, is pizzazz, juice. That if you do this stuff, stuff, I saw some of the stuff yesterday, because I'm going to walk around and see you doing it, I'm going to pop you on the head. This stuff here, you go. Now, think of a time when the client could get up and walk away and you would know. We could put another one in there and you'd look up and go. Now, it's just to remind you, all of the stuff you learned, you should be using all of the time. You don't use it as a sequence. It's now time to chunk it together. Once you practice little pieces and make them automated, then you're supposed to integrate them. And this is one of the things that's missing in a lot of training programs. They teach you the individual pieces, and then you leave them that way. Right? It's time then to recode, so that you learn to use your voice. Like those of you, how many of you learned like presuppositions, studied presuppositions? Right? How many of you used them yesterday to presuppose you get the information you wanted? Well, there. It's two. I'm impressed, actually. It's just a thought that the rest of you might have. The rest of you didn't learn about presupposition? Well, you probably don't have curiosity about that intensely, which will linger through the night and on into the weeks to come. Okay, now, what I want to do is take about 20 minutes apiece. You can get in groups of 2 or 3, but no more than that. I don't like you guys gangbang, because then what you do is you make one guy do the work and the rest of you take notes. That's not fair. It's also not getting in the ditches and really doing it. So groups of 2 or 3, take 20 minutes apiece, and if you have a group of 3, then only do 2, okay? Whenever you are dealing with strategies, you do not repeat. These models are not applicable for self-analysis. These models will put you into a recursive spin if you do and make you stupid. So they will. I guarantee it. Don't do it. Lots of people, their strategy to understand, lots of people understand by referencing to themselves. And a couple of people came up and wanted to ask questions about how this fit themselves. I won't even allow you to ask the question. Don't do it. The more you do it, the dumber it'll make you. Because it's like trying to elicit your own motivation strategy. What's going to happen is or your own decision strategy. These are models that were designed for you to get information from other people. They were not designed for self-analysis. The submodality models are designed to get information about yourself. It is a thing using your brain for a change. This is using somebody else's brain for a change. Okay? Only important thing is that you keep them separate. Models are designed to perform functions. And when you use them for a function for which they are not designed, the results are, number one, unpredictable, or predictably not useful. And I mean, lots of people, when we first started teaching strategies, there are lots of people that think, oh yes, Richard says this, and then they go in and they start doing it. But they don't realize that it creates things like, if you know what a worm program is in a computer, is that a familiar term to you? You can design a program, and what it does is it literally goes in, and once it's in the machine, it begins to eat up the data. It just goes through all the locations and destroys both the programs and the data that's there. And once you get them started, they haven't figured out a way to stop them yet. They know how to make them, but they don't know how to stop them. And I mean, and it's a very expensive thing, because all the hackers are playing with them now, and they get them started in the library, and it's all over. They have to literally slice out a whole area of data. You know, it's like cutting off your arm, to save your whole body. And these are kinds of things where you can put yourself in real recursive spins. And at first it doesn't feel like it's going that way, but trust me, don't play with this on yourself. It's not designed for that. You have to take these things literally. If you want to do self-analysis, you use a different model. You know, you want to cure phobia, you use the model for phobias. You don't use it with insomniacs because it's not designed for that. And, you know, it's like, you know, I think I'm going to go boating, I think I'll take my Chrysler. You know, it's not designed to float, don't use it for that. Okay, now, there's a couple things I want to say about what you were doing. Remember, the process that I was having you do was to familiarize yourself with something. I didn't promise you that asking the questions would get the answers that you wanted. It's not like that. But the trick is an overall modeling principle. It's a principle you use in all kinds of things, first for learning, but also in order to gather information. Now, this whole thing about, you know, you pick the response you want, you vary your behavior is all well and nice, but it doesn't happen to be where it's at. Where it's at in terms of gathering information is that you hold your behavior constant and find out, because it allows you to find consistency in somebody else. Now, some people consistently ask questions that were between-time questions and got in-time answers. As long as you notice that that's what you're getting, you still have the information. Because remember, there's another level we have to deal with yet, and that's the level of metaprograms. Because you got to understand, some people are just mismatchers. That's, you know, their whole world revolves around that. They're the kind of people where when you tell them about something, they try to find something that won't fit it. And I mean, these people, by the way, are a real joy to have in seminars, let me tell you. You know, these are the people that try to think, they run through, when you teach them something new, they run through and try to find something that won't fit into a pattern. Now, I could have told them out of the gate, there's a million things that don't fit in. First, you have to learn to do it. And then you do it, you don't make it up in your mind. And especially if you have an internal reference mismatcher, they can, of course, always come up with something that doesn't fit. And they always come up and they tell you, and they always phrase it this way. They come up and they go, well, I want to tell you something I'm uncomfortable about with this. And what I have to say to them is, I don't want to hear it. But see, the part of their learning strategy is that by telling you that this mismatches, then you're supposed to adjust it so that it fits in, because it's how they build generalizations. Now, the thing is once you've noticed the consistency of a response, what happens by holding your behavior constant, you remember when you were learning access and cues, that what we had you do was to ask 3 visual questions and 3 auditory questions, because you could notice the consistency of their response. That by asking certain kinds of questions, and literally by doing 2 that are for this and 2 that are for that, 2 whats, 2 whens, 2 wheres, by holding your behavior consistent, it makes it easier for you to notice the consistency in the other human being. Now, this is one of the major things that elicitation is about. I found that as I went around, many of you are just being too nice. And you're asking a question and you're getting an answer that's not an answer to your question. See, the thing is that you must make sure that the person heard the question. Because if the answer doesn't sound like it's related to it, most likely it's not. They made up a question in their head and they're answering it. They think they know what you mean. Make sure that when the information comes back, it's a direct answer to your question. I mean, if you ask somebody, you know, when are you happy? And, you know, I mean, some people will give you an answer from time to time, you know. But if somebody says, when I feel good, they didn't answer your question. You know, of course they're happy when they feel good. I mean, that's lovely, but it has nothing to do with telling you when. It doesn't answer the when part of the question. So therefore, it's a null set of information. And that's the point at which you must lean forward meaningfully, get a glare in your eye, step inside the 4-toed dragon we built last time. For those of you who don't have one of those, make sure they give you one before you leave. And roar at them and say, but when? You know, how do you know when to have it? I mean, when is it going to occur? Will you ever be happy again? And they go, if I feel good. They're answering still consistently cause-effect. As long as your brain hears it, the more you force it, the more you get the same answer. But still, they're not answering the question, which simply tells you that they're interpreting your question consistently, inappropriately. Their inability to deal with the question will probably allow you to be able to predict exactly where they're going to have trouble and where they're going to have advantages in their life. Because it'll fall out in terms of all the things that are on that sheet that you have in front of you, which is something about metaprograms. Now, we're not going to get into metaprograms real heavily here, but I want you to notice the distinctions. There are certain distinctions when people are trying to understand things. There are a lot of different ways to understand. Now, for example, if you find somebody who is always searching for a counterexample, okay, when you present to them a generalization about something, okay, generalizations are guides to your behavior. They're not truths. I mean, every generalization will collapse on itself at some point in time. That's why it's always possible to put a client in a double bind, because every generalization will destroy itself, including the one I just uttered. You can't make any universal statement where there aren't counterexamples. But yet the way people try to clarify to make their submodalities shift into the right place, remember that's what they're doing in order to understand, is to get all the submodalities in the right place so they can go, ah. Now, one of the things that they're doing is that they're engaging in a process. Now, somebody who is searching for counterexamples, one of my favorite examples of which is Robert Dilts. I mean, Robert Dilts is somebody who goes for a counterexample. They do that to force clarification. But by the same token, when you are presenting and asking for information, one of the things that will happen if you say, well, when are you happy? And if you get things like you go, well, when I'm not, you know, what they do is they start giving you counterexamples because they think they know what you're asking about. They are still capable of answering the question. It just requires a little unfriendly persuasion. It requires that you become adamant, or else you claim that they are incapable of answering your question. Therefore, they will have to provide you a counterexample by answering your question. I realize that's a little complicated, but you do have to pace. And this is, by the way, even though it doesn't sound like pacing, this is where pacing is really about. That if you want to get the answers and the information that you need, if somebody is compelled to give you counterexamples, then make sure that the only counterexample they can give you is to answer the question by claiming, you know. I mean, I told Robert one time, he was going in to teach a course, and Robert was a little long-winded in his teaching, one might say. He made Wyatt Woodsmall look like a comedian. And he did. And I mean, I taught a course with Robert in Washington, D.C. Actually, you were at this one, and they had like 18 blackboards or something that were actually part of the wall. And I came down, Robert started in the morning, and I walked in, and every single one of them was filled with writing, with sentences this big from one side to the other. And I walked in, and I looked in, and Robert was writing and talking to the blackboard. 125 people could have snuck out, and he wouldn't have noticed. So I told Robert, I said, I'm so depressed. I said, I'm giving up NLP. And he went, what? And I said, Robert, I said, if you can't take these techniques and learn to elicit positive responses from audiences where they're enjoying themselves, I just can't do this anymore. It's a counterexample to NLP. And Robert went, oh, no, I can do that. He went in and taught a group and turned around just like that, because he must provide counterexamples. His whole strategy operates that way. And it becomes a good learning tool. If you know how they work, you can use them effectively. None of them are better than others. They're not good, they're not bad. Some of them are a little more of a pain in the other. For example, the difference between matchers and mismatchers. Mismatchers are the ones that drive me nuts. They're not finding just a counterexample. They're finding everything that doesn't fit in what you just told them. You know, if you say it's a beautiful day and you go, yeah, but the temperature is a little this, and this is this, and this is this, and this is this, and they find everything outside the pattern. One of the things you will want is, if you should discover in the course of these 4 days that you are a wanton mismatcher, then one of the things you're going to have to do is to learn to mismatch that. Because you will be unable to use most of the techniques, because the techniques were all designed by a wanton matcher. Me. I'm looking for patterns, not for what's not in them. Because mismatchers are doing the thing about what they're doing to themselves is equivalent to going, what are you not thinking about right now? Which is not a good mechanism for having clear and concise understanding. They always feel that they're very intelligent, especially if you tell them they're dumb. But if you tell them that that's the brightest thing they can do is to notice everything that's not being talked about. Which means they hallucinate constantly. They're the most wanton hallucinators of information. You can give a lecture, and then when you hear them tell somebody else, they'll go and sit down and talk about everything that wasn't discussed. Which means they have to make it up because it wasn't discussed. Now, you'll find that if you teach seminars, and I know a lot of you in here do, that you will discover that these are very familiar things. But, again, they can be used, and in some cases, you can just alter them, because anything that's been learned can be changed. But changing things at that level is a very broad thing that goes through time constantly, because metaprograms are always at work. That's why they're called that. Now, what I want you to do next, let's see if we have enough time to do this. What I want you to do is, I want you, the same way that you elicited the motivation strategy, that is getting the parts that are the submodalities that make the step move, looking for those kickers in each step, and eliciting the individual steps. I want you now to do this with their understanding strategy directly. Because now, I want you to realize this all relates to what we just did, because what you are looking for is, does their understanding strategy, is it running in time, through time, or between time? What is it functioning to do? Now, on your list, there are some distinctions, because you will discover that their understanding strategy, in order to get to the point where the submodalities tell them they understand, right? Just like when you did this, like with submodalities, you found something they didn't understand and something they did understand, and you just went whack and pushed it over. Well, now you're going to go through the way they do it, which is probably a lot more work, because they're going to do things like where they will run comparisons. When they run comparisons, some people are going to be looking for the things that are similar, and some people are going to be looking for the things that are different. And in order to get to the point where you understand, when you look for similarities, people do similarities are going to go there real quick. The people that are looking for how things don't fit, right, are going to have a lot of trouble getting to the end, ever. Okay? Because see, there's a difference between understanding and understanding what somebody else means. Say, if you want to understand what somebody is describing to you, this is why the example I want you to use is, I want you to have them pick something they learned that was new. Not something where there was just a modification, but something they learned that was brand new, that they actually understood. And, if you have somebody that goes, well, that's a tough one, I'd just take it on your list and write down here and go under mismatcher and put a check. Because they can't even sort to find an example of what you're talking about. Obviously, they're going to be mismatching. So everything you do in this is going to tell you something. I want you to find out things about, are they building their learning off of things like, for example, are they using comparisons? Is it a cause-effect thing? I want you to look to find out not just the submodalities, not just the sequence, but which one of these kinds of things control the mechanisms. In other words, do they have to mismatch enough in order to get a clear picture? Do they have to match so much? Or do they have to find a counterexample? Or do they have to find no counterexamples before they can get a clear picture? Do they generate all kinds of counterexamples? And if one of them matches, then they can't make the picture? What is it that allows them to get to the point where they understand something which is brand new? Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. Now, I'm going to be very generous, and I'm going to give you 25 minutes apiece to do your elicitation. And I want you to keep in mind the rules that I taught you. Keep your behavior consistent. Don't wander while you do this. Remember, you want a tote. You want the test, then you want the operation, then you want the final test. And then the exit. When do they know they're done? You want to be able to go through it just like you did it, methodically. Even though that the TOTE isn't on the blackboard, it is burned indelibly in your mind, so that you don't try to do everything at once. First you find out, you sort for an example, something they learned that's new, and then you go through and then find out what set it off and what was the operation by which they actually understood. Then, of course, you can always raise the question about, did their understanding allow them to actually be able to do something, which will tell you whether they're an active or passive person. So use questions to find out both about what's on this list and about the strategies. Okay? Identify the mechanisms which preserve generalizations. That's what you get when you notice the consistency of a response. If people constantly stay in time, that's the way they can preserve a generalization. As long as they stay in time, they don't have to notice. How do people have, for example, have inconsistent beliefs? They do it between times. They do them different. They do one at one time and one at another, so they never conflict. I mean, it's a real easy way to do it. If you're in time having conflicting beliefs, you can't do it. They'll collide against one another. You Some people can think something's totally wrong and then turn around and do it. And that's because it's different. They're in different times. And typically they operate as a between-time person. Everybody can do all of these, but again, just like rep systems, they're going to have a propensity to spend the majority of their time doing one. You will find, where do you think kinnos are going to spend most of their time? Yeah. Think about it that way. It might begin to give you a clue. Okay, go for it. And get your motivation strategies going here. Don't forget, don't have amnesia for what we did yesterday. Use it. The point of eliciting the steps in the strategy is to find out that when they're doing the visual step, they may be matching, and then when they shift to the kinesthetic step, they may be mismatching. What you're after is the sequence that goes along with it. So you want to know that as they're building a new generalization, a new learning, they're going to go through variations of these things. Now, you may find somebody that just constantly matches, but there may actually be shifts. If there are, they'll be based on sensory modalities. When they get to the auditory step, then they'll mismatch. Otherwise, they're matching constantly. The information you're looking for is very small. Don't overload and drown yourself. You're just looking for, out of the distinctions that are there, if there is a shift as they're going through the strategy, you just want to know at what point do they switch from being doing one activity to doing another. Now, you'll find that most people don't go all the way through their strategy. The reason we're having you go through it step by step is so that you can concentrate on the mechanisms by which they preserve generalizations. We are not interested here in your eliciting their understanding strategy, per se. We're using that as an example, and you're supposed to remain meta to it, so that as you whip out these steps, what you're really interested in is noticing that the mechanisms that are up here, whether they're matching or mismatching, whether they're looking for counterexamples, whether it's internally. For example, external things, they may match, and internal ones, they may mismatch. We're looking for those combinations to find out, because they're going to tell us the ways by which people both preserve and build generalizations. What we're ultimately after here is about how to identify in a human being how they build generalizations. When I see a client, one of the things I do, which drives people up a wall usually when they first see me, because they expect me to go in and start shifting things right away. And sometimes I do, but a lot of times I drag it out for a while, where I ask them questions and I let them talk. I'm letting them talk, what I'm listening for, because what we're doing this exercise to tune up your ear. When you do it with people, you won't have to go through, I mean, maybe you will several times till it becomes familiar to you, but you begin to hear this stuff. You begin to hear how they preserve generalizations as they justify their behavior, no matter how bizarre it may be. I mean, I work with people, who somebody's 10 minutes late, they fall down and have a psychotic episode. Right? But the rest of their life is fairly normal. I mean, the lady that was on the film where I did that, I mean, this lady worked as a nurse. Surprisingly enough, she worked in emergency wards. That shouldn't be real surprising. And of course, suddenly, if people are late, she has nightmares, and, they cause her to have psychotic episodes. But I mean, if you can figure out how somebody builds a generalization, it tells you about whether you can do a quick fix on the thing, whether you have to do something that goes over time. I mean, in her case, it was real obvious that the way that she was doing it was a thing where she was going between times, and that it was very easy for me to go and do quick fix activity with her. Whereas if she had organized the world differently, she could have the exact same problem, but the way you would have to go about it would be totally different. It's not problems that produce the technique that you use, it's the way the person builds generalizations. Now, there are some problems, like phobias, that have to be done with certain kinds of activities. That's why there are some people that you'd be hard-pressed to give a phobia to. They would lose it after a while, but you can give it to them for a while. But it'll go away after a while, because they just don't have the mechanisms to preserve the phobia. People that do, that's why something like the standard phobia thing will work with most people. The trick here is to concentrate that as you move through the steps, you're looking for shifts in the things that are on that list. Concentrate on that. What you're supposed to be doing, this is an exercise not to change somebody, remember? This is to tune your ears up, to begin to hear this and to become familiar with new distinctions. When you first learned about rep systems and accessing cues, if some of you think back, like watching accessing cues was like overwhelming. Can you remember that? I remember when I was teaching it at first, like people going, God, you have to watch their eyes go up and then down, you know? Wow, man, you know, it's like, how am I going to keep track of all of this? You guys remember that shit? Like, it was so overwhelming. Well, you know, now you're doing something else, and at first, of course, it seems overwhelming. It's new. You know, I mean, I'm always surprised that, you know, now, you know, it's like, oh, yeah, you know, you get to the point where you barely even pay attention to them now. And I mean, the thing is that this is the same kind of activity. It's where I'm taking you through an experience to tune up your senses. You know how to elicit strategies. Just go through it. If you don't have it perfect, that's fine. But what you're after here is not so much the strategy by which they understand, but you want to remain meta, so you're getting information while you're doing an activity. What makes my work elegant is that I can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that's what I'm asking you to do, is while you're eliciting the strategy, I want you to concentrate on something else. Because you're good enough at the other stuff that, you know, eventually you're going to get it anyway. But while you're engaging in the activity, the information is going to fall out. It's going to fall out. You're going to begin to notice things like at this point, they're matching. Like when data is coming in, they're going match, match, match. They check their feelings, then they sort for the feelings that don't fit with it. Because they have to find out whether it's going to be their general, whether they're going to accept this new idea. It has to fit for them. See, some people, the only thing that allows them to know it's new is that if it doesn't fit. Otherwise, it's not new. See, there are people that ask you when you're training, they ask you questions, they go, is this the same as that? You know, I mean, when I was first teaching, people would come up and they'd go, is this stuff about the representational systems the same as in the parent, child, and the adult in transactional analysis? And I would look at them and go, no. And the thing is that they would go, ah, because that wasn't the answer they wanted. They wanted me either to explain how it wasn't or to explain it. And by just giving them a one-word answer, taking them literally, what happened is their entire process of understanding ground to a halt. And they go into a deep trance, and I could just look at them and go, now close your eyes, you know, because it was a pattern interrupt, because the pattern that was working is that they need to force information to fit the way they understand and learn. Now, until people learn flexibility at that level, you just have to know that it's there and how to work with it. And you can still know, and it tells you that when you're working with clients or individuals, and see, to me, you know, it's not just doing therapy when you're working with people. When I do business consulting, when I teach groups, when I do sales training, and when I sell something, it's all the same thing. If I know how they build a generalization, I can build the idea that this is the best car to buy, and no doubt about it. But I have to know how it works in order for me to be more elegant. One of the ways to do that is to be able to operate at multi-level. So while you're engaging them in the activity, because very often, if you really look at the tapes where I'm working with clients, I have them engaging in an activity which will look familiar to neurolinguistic programmers, but it's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is gathering information. Remember, the rule of thumb is 99% of your activity is gathering information, 1% is using it. And actually, a large percent of it is also testing to make sure the information you have is accurate. But that's the same thing as gathering information. You gather information, you test it. You gather it, you test it. Once you have the information, then you'll know what to do. Then it takes just one little tap on the pipe, and the plumbing works. Okay, go back to it. Now, the process of being able to build generalizations itself in another human being requires that you know how they do it, because once you know how they build a generalization, a new learning, there is a trick to this. And one of the reasons I'm restricting your time is that if you're taking more time, you're doing more than you need to. You're doing too much. A lot of people think they're not doing enough. You're doing things you don't need to. You need to focus in on what you want to find, and when you find it, you're done. This is the thing about, remember, the getting warmer and closer strategy? This is what's real useful. You just need to be warm enough so that you stay meta, so that you start looking for the distinctions on that sheet. You don't need to know all of them. You need to know which ones are the major ones. Now, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and just jump. Because remember, familiarity is built off of variety. And this is the other reason I want you to change. Even if you're not done, if I say change every 20 minutes, just change. Even if you're not finished. It's not important that you finish these exercises. Now, there are some workshops where I do things like submodality things. I want everybody to go all the way through. We will get to the point where I want you to go all the way through. Right now, what I want you to do is to build mechanisms in yourself that do pattern recognition.